Hello everyone, welcome to Godly Play at St. James at the corner of Duke and Orange. I have a story for you today. It's the story of David, and it's found in the Old Testament in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. So, let's begin. Our story begins in the town of Bethlehem. A man named Jesse lived in the town of Bethlehem. He had many sons. One day, the prophet Samuel went to Bethlehem to look for the next king. A prophet is someone who comes close to God, and God comes close to them, and they know what God is saying. Well, Samuel knew that God had sent him to Bethlehem to look for the next king. He went to Jesse's house and said, "I would like to meet your sons." Jesse introduced 6 of his sons to Samuel, but Samuel said, "Do you have another son?" And Jesse said, "Yes, my youngest son is out in the fields watching the sheep." Jesse brought him to Samuel. His name was David. And Samuel knew immediately that he was the one whom the Lord meant to be the next king. Samuel took his flask of oil and poured it on David's head and anointed him king. But this was very confusing because Israel already had a king, King Saul. But Saul had changed. An evil spirit tormented him. Still, David would not begin to rule until Saul died. Saul's sickness became worse. Someone suggested that music might help him feel better. So they brought David in with his harp to play his harp and sing songs to King Saul. We still have some of David's songs in the book of Psalms in the Bible. When David was a young boy, there was a great war in the land. The Philistines wanted the land for themselves. The army of the people of God and the army of the Philistines were lined up, ready to fight. A huge man, like a giant, came out to challenge Saul's army. His name was Goliath. No one wanted to fight him. When David heard about the challenge, he said he would fight Goliath. They tried to put the king's armor on him, but David said it was too heavy. He said, "All I need is my slingshot and my shepherd's staff and 5 smooth stones." He said when he was out in the fields protecting his sheep, he used these to protect them from wild lions and wild bears. And he would also use them to protect the people from Goliath. And he did. He killed Goliath, and the people never forgot how brave David was. When he grew up, he became a soldier in the army of the king. King Saul had many sons. One was named Jonathan. And Jonathan and David became close friends, close like brothers. Jonathan protected David, even from his father, the king. The king was very jealous of David. David was a great soldier, and over time he grew even more popular than the king himself. This made the king so angry that he wanted to kill David. Jonathan knew the only way for David to be safe was he were to run away and hide from the king. This meant the 2 good friends had to say goodbye. King Saul and his sons led the army against the Philistines once more, and this time the king and his sons were killed. When David heard the news, he was very sad. He would never forget his good friend Jonathan. Now it was time for David to become king. They brought the king's crown and placed it on his head. And the people said, "You will be a shepherd to all of the people." At that time he was 30 years old, and he would be king for 40 more years. One of the things that King David did was to go to the city of Jerusalem and make it a city for God's people. But there was something missing. The ark was missing. The ark held the 10 best ways that God gave to the people and to Moses out in the desert. And David wanted them back in the city of Jerusalem. But the Philistines had stolen the ark in one of their battles. So David took his army out to meet the Philistines and take back the ark. When they brought it into Jerusalem, King David danced in front of the ark. It was then carried to its place in the tent, just like it was in the desert. In the spring of the year, David sent his army to war, but David remained in Jerusalem. One day, he saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba, and he wanted her for himself. But Bathsheba was already married to a soldier named Uriah. David sent Uriah into battle where he knew he would be killed, and then King David married Bathsheba. One day, the prophet Nathan came to King David with a parable to tell. It went like this. In a town, there was a poor man and a rich man. And the rich man had many sheep. The poor man had only one little lamb, but he loved this little lamb, and he took it into his house and made it his pet. He let that little lamb climb on his table and eat off his plate and drink out of his cup and even nap on his lap. Well, one day the rich man needed a sheep to make a special meal. Even though he had many sheep himself, he didn't want to kill any of them. So he decided to take the poor little lamb from the poor man into his house and kill it and use it for his special meal. David was furious with the rich man in the story, and he said, "As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did this thing and has no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are that rich man. God has given you everything, and yet you took Uriah's wife for yourself." David was filled with sorrow, and he wept. He was very sorry for what he had done. He wondered if he would die, but he didn't. But the first son that he had with Bathsheba did die, and they were both filled with sorrow. But later, they had another son named Solomon. He would become the next king, and he would build a beautiful temple for God. King David was not a perfect king. He made many mistakes. But when he realized his mistakes, he said he was sorry and asked God to forgive him, and God did. When David was old and full of years, he died, and he was buried in Jerusalem. His son Solomon became the next king, and he continued to rule over Jerusalem. And he built the great and beautiful temple to God.